Hi, welcome to Fix a Risk, where we help you to do exactly that. Today, we will mitigate the risk of working in a SIEM that lack objectives defined, documented, and accepted. We will go through the steps to collect SIEM objectives so they are aligned with the business needs. If you have a SIEM already, don't worry. This content suits to any situation regardless the age, technology, and dimension of your environment. This is the second episode of a SIEM series. In Portugal, we have a saying: "O que nasce torto, tarde ou nunca se endireita." That would translate for something like, "What is born crooked, late or never straight." In our context, it means that mistakes made at the start will be hard or impossible to fix later. Therefore, we want to avoid predictable issues and have a strategy to allow us build a robust and resilient SIEM. We will accomplish this by identifying all SIEM objectives, but instead of looking first in the technology, we will focus on the business. Let's create a scenario so we can start checking the risks. Team starts simple. They onboard a few systems and create rules based on what is visible in the logs. Those rules are grouped into use cases and the process is repeated for other systems. In this scenario, let's examine the rules that are created. We know that IT exists to support business needs, and it would be expected to have a part of the service oriented for business security monitoring. If we classify the rules considering what they monitor, we can certainly see that most, and if not all, of them are IT-oriented but not business-oriented. This happens as rules are created considering the logs that systems send to SIEM and possibly nothing else. Let's take then two examples based on login events to see how this approach differ. From the IT perspective, we would see rules to detect possible password brute force. But from the business perspective, we would see something completely different as rules to notify possible unauthorized access to financial assets. Both cases check for login events, but the nature and criticality of them is drastically different. Don't get me wrong. Having IT rules is good and desirable. The risk comes mostly for not having the ones focused on business and design the whole platform looking only from the IT perspective. Even at this point, there are still other risks related with the lack of objectives defined for SIEM. One of them is that because SIEM is built and managed by engineers with strong IT background, they may be focused too much in the technical part to make things work, regardless the impact towards service, operations, or customers. These hard-coded rules work when they are developed, but they are not resilient to any change in the environment. Again, let's pick some examples. One IT hard-coded rule for possible password brute force would look something like this, where a rule logic focuses on specific conditions that only work for particular systems and vendors. If we follow this approach throughout SIEM, each vendor would require its own set of rules to detect possible password brute forces. This approach is not desirable at all, as it will create a microenvironment each time a log source is onboarded. Instead, rules should be normalized. Today we will not enter into details regarding normalized content, as this video goal is to see how to define SIEM objectives. Still, a normalized rule for possible password brute force would look something like this. It is normalized as it works for any technology, system, or vendor. There is a chance that some viewers are now typing in the comments that these rules will create a lot of false positives if implemented this way. Yes, that is correct. These are not real rules to be implemented as is, but rather to help identify the difference between hard-coded and normalized contents. For business-oriented content, this normalization methodology is extended even further. In this case, we consider the nature of both user and system to assess if we are facing a possible unauthorized access to financial assets. Again, all of this comes after the objectives are defined. One efficient SIEM would look the opposite of this. By defining the objectives in the very beginning, we will be better prepared to see beyond the systems that are existing today, have a clear understanding what are the business needs and priorities, assure we know what is required from the system themselves so they can be configured in the right way, and suppress hard-coded content so the service can be as standard and optimized as possible. This can be accomplished and is actually not that hard. It just requires some methodology, and that is what I will show you right away. What I will share is something I wish I was told when I started working with SIEM in IT security. There are multiple ways to accomplish the same results, but at least this methodology works. Let's first understand where we are heading, so the next steps we can ask the right questions and document the most useful information we can get. Good objectives need to help us to know which events to collect, which threats to monitor, how to store the information, which assets are involved, and how to respond to security incidents. Good objectives will also allow us to identify the right technical requirements that teams should follow during the deployment. All information will be compiled and documented in a master use case plan. We start with it as it will allow us to have a single point of truth for our SIEM strategy that addresses both business and IT needs. It will help us to know how an ideal SIEM implementation should look like for our context and will help to identify the concrete technical requirements we need to implement. Before we start building the master use case plan, let's define what our mindset should be at this point. We should not focus on any technology. We should not restrict on what we can or cannot do as of today. We should not restrict on what our individual knowledge is regarding the organization and how it works. And we should not focus on timeframes, namely when those objectives will be completed and mature enough to provide the expected level of security. Instead, we should spend the energy to understand the business. Remember, a SIEM is not a toy for IT people to play around, but rather a tool for business to protect their assets. To best serve the business, we should start by understanding what are the biggest risks for the information security, not only what we want to protect, but also what can hurt us. As an example, do we depend a lot on external parties, and if so, to which extent? Do we have our associates in VPN and mobile? How they use it and what type of information is stored on those devices? Can our customers be the target as well? For instance, as it happens in the case of the financial industry? How important is our social media and website? If applicable, how is personal or healthcare information handled, stored, and processed? As well, what kind of obligations we have with law and regulatory agencies? These and other questions help to understand the business, and while doing so, we should document all the use cases that may be relevant to monitor, regardless if they can or not be deployed soon. These use cases should not focus on the systems, but rather in the security and business needs. A tip: if you work in a mid-large organization, you probably have a risk team. Talk to them. Explain what you want to accomplish and ask for their input. It will surely be a great help. To understand the organization in more detail, it is recommended to pick visuals to help brainstorm SIEM objectives. We should obtain or draft the process and value chain for the business. Even if we think we have a trivial process, it's better to spend time understanding it, especially the conditions and exceptions that exist. It does not need to be very detailed, but something to help understand the flow of information and how things actually work. If no documentation like that exists, the best way is to have it by interviewing the colleagues that are familiar with the process. Other visual that will help is a simplified network diagram. Instead of going through the actual network diagrams, which can be very overwhelming, we can instead schedule a short workshop with a knowledgeable network manager to obtain the information we need and draw the simplified network diagram from there. Later, if it helps, we can also search online for CISO mind map to find common IT security scopes that we may have in the organization but may not be reflected in our diagram. These are relevant to keep in mind as they can feed events to SIEM that later can help detect possible security incidents. With these diagrams, we should be able to understand how the business works and how the systems are designed to support it. This information will be very important in the next step. Alright, we should then brainstorm for possible security incidents, and it is better to gather a team for that. This way, the outcomes are richer and we avoid having a single individual defining the overall monitoring strategy for the organization. While working with a team, do not restrict the creativity by negating or challenging the ideas, as one strange idea can lead to a good one. Instead, work to keep everyone engaged in finding possible threats, regardless the plausibility and applicability. We should document every possible security incident, even if today we cannot monitor or detect it. The organization may now lack the controls to mitigate some of the threats, but still, it is important to have it part of the long-term plan. One important thing. Although it feels like a good idea, I would recommend not to research use cases online, at least for now. If we do it, we can limit our creativity to find use cases aligned with our organization needs, and therefore, it's better to do it in later stages. For the process perspective, the approach is similar to what we shared before, where, for instance, we can identify events out of order, activities done by users that do not match their role, a typical repetition of actions, or even transactions done without respecting the normal flow of information. If you'd like to see how to do this exercise hands-on, please comment proposing a business sector. I plan to create videos to discuss risks that particular businesses have, but I would like to avoid starting with areas where I have experience just to reduce the chances of people thinking that I'm talking about specific organizations or customers from my past. While we are brainstorming, all ideas can be documented in the master use case plan, which will contain a good list of all possible security threats. One tip: we should also document business as usual activities so later we can distinguish them and reduce the volume of alerts that are non-issues. For instance, passwords can be changed by users from specific groups or service accounts, but only under particular conditions. Or, in the other way, we can also have money transfers being done by users that only belong to specific roles. At this point, it is time to enrich use cases and define priorities. We will look at all situations that were identified and group them into use cases. Remember that not all use cases are IT-oriented, and it's better that they are business-oriented when possible. After we reach this point, it is then okay to check online for SIEM use cases to see if there are other scenarios or situations that could be relevant for us to add to our plan. Based on what we learned before about the organization, we should be in a good shape to be proactive and propose use case priorities. Later, our proposal will be adjusted with stakeholders' expectations. The priorities should consider only the information security risk and should not depend if the control mechanism today is in place or not, neither the complexity of the use case. With the prioritization complete, not only we know the SIEM objectives, but we also know where it would make sense to start and which subjects we can leave to address in the future. Another tip is, when deciding what to implement first, balance complex use cases with quick wins. Some quick wins can ignore the priority and be implemented first, as they will give results fast with little effort involved. On the other hand, there are complex cases that require a lot of time for testing and tuning. For instance, some activities are not frequent and only happen once a month or even less frequent. For those, we would gain if we set them as soon as possible to allow reliable data to be collected through time and assure that it will be available when we really need it. We are almost in the end of the methodology to identify SIEM objectives, and what we are missing now is to define the use case conditions. What I'm going to say now may seem obvious, but I have to. Please do not implement a SIEM using trial and error approach to define the conditions. Way too often the use cases are implemented with random conditions using trial and error approach rather than actually well-thought logic. Surely, some of the conditions will need to be tweaked in the future, but tweaking something is not the same as trial and error. Besides that, one risk here is that the entity that implements the controls should not be the same that decides the security logic. As case something does not work as expected, the implementer will not have a way to defend himself. Before SIEM objectives are signed off, a clear definition of rules should be already in place so everyone understands what is expected from the SIEM and from the team that managed it. These are some examples of conditions that can be defined for the use cases. Actually, let me bring the example shared before so we can have something concrete to look at. This logic cannot be implemented as is, but it clearly helps everyone, even a non-technical person, to see what is expected from this rule of possible unauthorized access to financial assets. We finally have the master use case plan, but this does not mean that we are ready to implement it just yet. All stakeholders should still review the plan, including reviewing the activities that led to this plan and acknowledge the implementation priorities. Questions may come, and any changes should be discussed and incorporated in the plan after some agreement. This is also the time to identify time objectives and other milestones so we have concrete indicators to measure the project success. This step is quite important since based on our capability and agreed priority, some things will not be implemented anytime soon and, therefore, will automatically be considered as residual risks for the organization. The acknowledge and acceptance of residual risks is out of scope since it is pure risk management activity that is not specific to SIEM. With this, we have now the SIEM objectives defined as well as a plan to fulfill them. It's time to celebrate this accomplishment. We will finish this video by seeing where this work will lead us from here forward, namely the extraction of SIEM requirements. For this, let me bring the SIEM strategy that was shared in the first video. By having the objectives defined, we can see several subjects that are directly influenced by our master use case plan. In the monitoring logic domain, besides the obvious use case subject, we will also be able to have a clear input for the rules and work instructions that will be required. On the engineering part, we will be able to know which systems to be onboarded. But the big gain happens in the requirements for standardization domain where, as we saw in some examples today, we will be able to understand which event categories, fields, and key security events will our SIEM need. Also from the business context, we will be able to define the requirements for the asset model. For instance, this part is where we had the logic to identify what a financial user or a financial asset are. These subjects will matter to discuss in future videos. To conclude today's video, we have now objectives that are business-oriented instead of only IT. No need to do trial and error activities with the risks of creating gray areas. We have high capability to have content normalized instead of hard-coded. We have a plan that was developed with use case priorities that work as a single point of truth for development. Stakeholders were engaged from the start and helped define the success criteria prior to implementation, and also the technical requirements are now obtainable rather than found by chance. To avoid making this video too long, I excluded some details on this methodology. Please reach me in the comments in case there is any clarification that you would like to have, or if you see something that we could do differently. I may release other video where I detail further the steps on how to build this master plan, and that would incorporate answers to your questions. This is what I would have to you in today's episode. Until then, keep an eye for the next videos so we can work together to fix a risk.